Okay, we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. And I apologize ahead of time if this is a little disjointed. I might meander a little bit. It's kind of a complicated topic that I'm going to try to get through relatively quickly. This is a picture right here of Lenin. He was the Bolshevik leader, the eventual leader of communist Russia. Now, the Tsar was in charge, the Romanovs, and the guy in charge here was Nicholas II. It was an absolute system. It was still absolutist. This is one of the real last absolutist regimes from the old European societies to be left after World War I, the fall of Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans. You're really left with Russia and the Tsars. And there was social injustice. They were still had the serf system, even though the serfs were freed. It's still basically a serf system. And people were upset. There was a lot of discontent. In 1905, this was really the last attempt by people to make a peaceful stab at reform. A bunch of people went over to the Tsar's palace as a peaceful protest, and they were met with the army, who shot into the crowd, killed a bunch of people. They called this Bloody Sunday. Thousands of people then subsequently were arrested and imprisoned, and they cracked down on reform. It's had a couple big impacts. One of the main impacts was the people no longer felt the Tsar was like a father figure to them. Now the Tsar was somebody who killed them. In addition, all of reform movement was forced underground. So if you look here in 1905, again, the Tsar had unlimited power. There was no constitution, no political parties. There was a very strong secret police. And anybody that wanted to reform the Tsar's movement, especially after Bloody Sunday 1905, had to do it again in secret, underground. It was very dangerous. There was a rigid class system. The Orthodox Church had a lot of power. And then, of course, you had the boyars, which is this nobility on top. All the land and power, obviously, were in the rich. Most people's lives in these serfs were peasants that were farmers, or if they were working in factories. They did have some factories in Russia. Their life really just sucked. It was awful. They didn't educate people. They figured if they were educated, then they could realize that their life was bad. They might be able to do something about it. Instead, they had this emphasis on being Russian, Russification, with the traditional language and dress and songs and pogroms. Let's go get the Jews over there, who are these separate group of people living in this situation. So socially, it was ready to go. Economically, it was still very much an agricultural society, where they did try to industrialize. Here they did have some factories, but the cities were poorly put together. These factories were awful working conditions, and it just wasn't great. So in 1917, in the middle of World War I, people tried to end Tsars, the absolutists. And what did people want? The farmers wanted land that were owned by the nobles. The city people wanted better living conditions and some food, and the middle class wanted a voice. There was not a large middle class, but the ones that were there did want a voice. So they had a revolution. If you see this here, peasant unrest is in green. The little sickle and hammers are areas of the Bolsheviks, which was the communist leadership. I'll get to them in a second. And then you have mutinies, and I mean, because widespread. Remember, over here, nobody lives over here in this area. This is all Siberia. So a lot of the population lives west of the Ural Mountains in that area. Here's another slide to give you in 1914, 1921, as this revolution and subsequent civil war spread. You had the areas really controlled by the Bolsheviks out in orange, and towns that they took power in these little stars. And then, of course, in 1921, here is essentially Communist Russia's territory from the red line here to the east. So in World War I, the Russians had a lot of casualties. They were very poorly led, bad officer corps. They had very poor supplies. The home front bogged down. People were upset. There was people were starving. It was really just awful. They were not unprepared for war in 1914, which is ironic because they're the ones that marched off to war in support of Serbia, that got attacked by Austria-Hungary. They should never have done that, and they found themselves embroiled in a war they were completely unprepared for, and they were just getting defeated and defeated and defeated. Now, the Tsar, in a kind of misguided attempt to show leadership, goes to the front to help lead. Doesn't help, and he's gone, and he's over in the front. So the Tsarina, who was a woman by the name of Alexandra, a descendant of Queen Victoria, she basically is in charge, and the whole family gets influenced by this crazy-looking guy here named Rasputin. This is Rasputin, who was a monk, a crazy monk, kind of a guy that had claimed to have powers, but if you read some of the stuff he did, I can't tell you about it. You got to read about it. It's a lot of debauchery and everything else. Now, Rasputin gained power in the royal family because he helped with Alexei. Alexei, the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne, Nicholas II's son, had hemophilia. His blood would not clot. And in one episode that he got bruised and was bleeding profusely internally, Rasputin kind of supposedly healed him. And Alexandra, seizing on any chance for her son to live, befriended Rasputin and brought him over to the royal palace. And he suddenly had a lot of influence over the royal family, which was very dangerous for all the other Russian nobles. And people hated Rasputin, especially the nobility and the people in general. They didn't trust him. They thought he had bewitched, had a sorcerer or cast a spell on the royal family. So when the Tsar left, the Tsarina was left in charge, and Rasputin subsequently gets himself assassinated. And the Tsarina, in addition with this assassination, you had then a bunch of protests against the government. They sent the troops out to put the protests down, and the Russian military soldiers just overthrew their officers and joined the protests, and essentially the whole government came down. It's a little anticlimactic, but the government of the Tsar fell like a house of cards very quickly. So Rasputin here is very enigmatic. He's mysterious. He was misunderstood. And here is Alexei the Tsarevich. He was a nice young man for all purposes, doomed, unfortunately, from the start. So when they went to kill Rasputin, it's an interesting story. If you allow me to digress quickly here, they poisoned him. These are nobles I'm talking about. They gave him cyanide, and they left the room, and they put it in his drink. And they left the room, and they came back, and he had drinking the wine and with the cyanide in it, and was still walking around. So they shot him, and they shot him 3 times, and he was still alive. So they took a dumbbell and they beat him to a pulp, yet he was still alive. So they tied up his arms and legs. They wrapped him in basically it says cloth, I believe it was a carpet, and they dumped him in this like icy river. Finally, he died. They pulled the body out. They did an autopsy, and this is what it said. There was no alcohol. There was alcohol, but no poison. So what happened to the cyanide? He had 3 bullet wounds, one in the chest, and a couple in the kidneys, one in his head, and a small amount of water was found in his lungs. So he drowned. He ended up dying of drowning, and some of the bindings, some of the knots were untied. So when he was in the river, he was actually still trying to get out, which is kind of an amazing true story that he was poisoned, bludgeoned, and shot, and eventually died of drowning. So you can read up on Rasputin as you want. Now, the Duma, which was the parliament, Russia's equivalent of a parliament, officially took over. They created something called the Provisional Government, which is the government that came after Nicholas II, and the Tsar abdicated. He stepped down from the throne March 1917, which is almost a year before World War I ended. Again, he was in the front. Now let's review. Excuse me to digress here a little bit. This is where it gets a little confusing. We got to rewind and go into the Socialist Movement, which were one of the big reform movements against the Tsar. That started in the 1800s, but in 1903 it split into 2 factions, 2 groups: the Mensheviks and who we really care about, the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were more democratic. The Bolsheviks were more radical. The Bolsheviks, who ended up winning, led by Lenin, wanted a small professional revolutionaries, or guys that's their profession. The revolutionaries were going to lead, and they weren't really into democracy. Lenin was a very good public speaker. He was in Switzerland when the Tsar stepped down. So in order to get over to Russia again, he was in exile. He kind of fled the Tsar's secret police. To get over to Russia again, he worked out a deal with the Germans to let him in. He said, listen, if you let me over there, I'll get us out of the war. And the Germans said, sounds good to us, and they let him go back to Russia. So when he comes back, he starts campaigning, and he wants to kind of take over the provisional government, and he's calling for land, bread, and peace. That's important. Stick that in your notes. Land for the peasants, bread for the workers, and peace for the soldiers. That was kind of his campaign slogan, and it worked. Easy to remember. Trotsky, who's another guy you need to know here, his name's Leon Trotsky. He was Lenin's organizer. He, again, was in exile, happened to be in the United States when the Tsar abdicated. He comes back to Russia with a bunch of American money. There was a communist movement in the United States, and he gets their kind of support, and they come together to take over. So it's really Lenin, and then the organizer behind the scenes is a guy named Leon Trotsky. Trotsky lived after Lenin died. He was the Stalin's main rival for power. Stalin takes over, and Trotsky flees. And Trotsky's rallying against Stalin, and he's in Mexico City, and 2 KGB assassins kill him with an ice pick, which is another little story on the side. So the first revolution happens, I believe, in we said March. The provisional government takes over. About 6 months later, the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government. So there's a second revolution led by the communists. The first revolution was not communist. It was against the Tsar. Tsar's gone, the provisional government's there, and the Bolsheviks take over the provisional government about 6 months later. The reason the provisional government failed, it stayed in the war, it didn't end the food shortages, and it did not support the peasants getting the land. It did not provide bread, land, and peace that the Bolsheviks were saying they would. So the provisional government failed, the Bolsheviks took over. The Bolsheviks then had democratic elections, and to their shock, they didn't win. Nobody wanted to be communist. They just didn't want the provisional government. So Trotsky, in a classic move, refuses to accept the outcome. Says, well, people don't really know what they want. And they just ignore the election results. They stay in power. And from that time on, they never have democratic elections again until the end of the communists in the 1990s. Immediately after that election, there's a civil war erupts, and it's a bloody civil war. It goes on for a number of years. It starts really in 1918, and it goes on all the way really to 1924. Most of it's over by 1920, between the Reds, which are the Bolsheviks led by Lenin, and the Whites. The Whites are the anti-Bolshevik group, and unfortunately they kind of associate themselves with the Tsar and their family. At this time, the Bolsheviks have the Tsar and his family in kind of at a house arrest in one of their towns that they control. And the Whites are going to free them. So this is a very bloody civil war. There's a lot of peasants die as a result, and again, I can't really get into a lot of detail, but it's bad. Firing squads and people are running around trying to take care of business here. They have a Red Terror, which harkens back to the French Revolution, where anybody that's seen as against the new Bolshevik government is targeted. They're trying to really scare people into going along with them. They have a secret police. Later becomes known as the Cheka. Later kind of evolves into kind of the KGB. And the Tsar and his family get assassinated. They have, at the time, 5 kids. Olga's 23, Tatiana's 21, Maria's 19, Anastasia's 17, and poor Alexei is only 14. They're in this house in a Bolshevik town. They get told they're going to have a family picture. It's in the middle of the night. They go downstairs, and a bunch of people walk in the room, and they shoot them all dead. There was this, the movie Anastasia, the Disney movie, where she lived. She didn't live. The whole family gets gunned down. They couldn't be allowed to live. If they lived, the revolution was wrong. So they weren't allowed to do that. And as soon as they didn't really tell anybody that they died. They just kind of disappeared. And from that time on, it was kind of forbidden to talk about the Tsar and his family. The USSR is officially formed, the United Soviet Socialist Republics, in 1922. And they are alive and well all the way up to basically 1990. If you look at the timeline here, you could freeze it. I'm going to keep moving, but basically here it is. It gives you the timeline. Freeze the film if you need to. There's a legend that Anastasia lived. However, in 2007, they found 2 more skeletons, and they've basically been identified as Anastasia and Alexei. So the poor people did die. This is a picture of Anastasia, of Alexei and the Tsar when they're in captivity in 1917. They identified the remains with DNA, and in 2008 they basically said everybody has been accounted for. Here is Olga and Alexei again when they were on the train. So all the Romanovs have been accounted for. I'm going quickly, but you could pause and read through if you so desire. But that's basically what it's talking about. Okay, so there's a quick summary of the Russian Revolution. It's complicated. I would consult the book as well. Thank you.